Hello everyone. In this lecture, we will talk about entropy and free energy. And these are the learning outcomes. First, we will look at the entropy. We'll define what is entropy. And we will look at how entropy along with enthalpy and temperature are involved in the calculation of free energy. And from the value of the free energy, you will learn how to predict whether a reaction is favorable or unfavorable. Okay, back to our previous lecture, we learned that when a reaction is exothermic or when it has a negative delta H, that reaction is always favorable. And we had this simple hypothesis by saying that all exothermic reactions are favorable. But then we came across to the example of an ice pack, which is an endothermic reaction. This reaction is possible as well. So how is this possible? Well, this only means that delta H is not the ultimate indicator for us to predict whether a reaction is possible or not. And in the subsequent slides, we'll discuss what would be the ultimate predictor or what would be the ultimate indicator that a reaction can happen spontaneously. As a matter of fact, there are altogether three parameters that will decide the favorability of a reaction. Well, we have learned about the first one, which is delta H or the entropy. And we know that a reaction that comes with a negative delta H is always favorable. And a second parameter is temperature, which is measured in Kelvin. So high temperatures will make a reaction more favorable. The higher is the temperature, the more favorable is a reaction. And a third parameter that we're going to study in more details today is entropy or delta S. So a higher delta S value or a more positive delta S value will make a reaction more favorable as well. So how much do you know about entropy? And showing here are just some feedback I collected from a senior last year. So basically, they agreed that entropy has something to do with disorderliness, randomness, messiness, chaos, and so on. Okay, essentially, entropy isn't just about disorder, and it has more meaning attached with entropy, really. So, showing here was an experiment I tried with the seniors last year. Now, assuming this is your lecture hall with different students represented by all these blue dots. So what I tried last year was that I passed a series of cards from number 1 to 20 to the first student over this left hand side. Then the duty of this student is to pass a card as quick as possible to any random person sitting next to him or her across the lecture hall. And eventually, I'm going to collect the card from the last person over here and we'll look at the sequence of the cards. Okay, that's simple. So, do you expect the cards to come back in the right sequence? Definitely not. They are all mixed up. That is because what we observe here is essentially entropy. You have an increase in entropy in the process of cards distribution. So what is entropy? It is a measure of the ways or different ways by which energy, which are represented by the number cards, can be distributed in a system of molecules, which are students in this experiment. And because there are many possible ways by which energy can be distributed, we end up with chaos and disorderliness. And such chaos and disorderliness is calculated by this parameter entropy or delta S. In fact, the increase in entropy is a universal phenomenon. In other words, the universe always gets messier with time, which is very true. Now, if you look at the Big Bang, our universe began from a single point, what known as the singularity, and now there are trillions upon trillions of stars and galaxies. So it proceeded from a state of orderliness to a state of disorderliness. And let me give you two more examples. If you have a deck of cards and if you shuffle it several times, you are most likely to get a messy combination than before. Likewise, if you add coffee with milk, it is going to mix spontaneously rather than to stay in two layers. And that's because of entropy. Remember, entropy and disorderliness increase over time. Again, entropy measures how disordered a system is because there are many ways we can distribute energy within a system. And according to the second law of thermodynamics, delta S, which is entropy change, is always positive or zero. So imagine if you have an egg sitting in a carton. When there's no changes, delta S is equal to zero. But when you crack the egg white and yolk come out of the eggshell, it becomes messier, so delta S becomes positive. And when you cook the egg, you scramble the egg white and the yolk, it becomes even more disordered. Therefore, you have a larger value for delta S. So a simple observation is that you can always increase the entropy in the system, but can you revert the process by putting the egg white and the yolk back to the shell? It is very difficult, if not impossible. Likewise, is it easier to make your room messy or tidy? Well, we all know the answer. So the next time you are asked to tidy up your room, just tell your parents you are abiding the rules of physics. Likewise, the amount of entropy in the universe will always increase with time. In other words, the amount of usable energy or free energy will only decrease with time. So to speak in the context of cosmology, people speculate on a gloomy fate of the universe, which ultimately will reach a state of thermal equilibrium, or we call it thermal death, when there is no more free energy in the universe to do any work or any chemical reactions. Okay, coming back to our co-pack, which is an endothermic reaction. How is it possible? How is it favorable? Now, think about this. What happens when you press the co-pack? Yes, you are bursting the water sac so that the ammonium salt get dissolved. Showing below is an equation of the dissolution of ammonium nitrate salt. What do you observe with regards to the state of the reactants and product molecules? Yes, the answer is we are turning salt in the solid state into aqueous ions. They are free moving within the solution. In other words, the process of dissolution increases entropy. So whenever we turn a solid into a liquid and from liquid to gas, we are increasing the entropy within that system. And conversely, if we turn a gas into liquid and from liquid to solid, we are reducing the entropy within the system. So here in this example of the ice pack, when we dissolve the salt, we are increasing entropy within the system as the ions are now no longer fixed within the crystal lattice. So they are free to move around. So with a very big value of entropy, which is a very positive delta S, that drives the reaction. So although it is entopically unfavorable, which means when it is endothermic with a positive delta H, it is still possible for this reaction to happen when the delta S is very positive. And now please try this question. Which one of these reactions decreases entropy? And the answer is C, from freezing water to ice cubes, because it proceeds from disorderliness to orderliness. So now you have learned about two important parameters for us to predict whether a reaction can happen or not. Number one is about delta S. So when delta S, or the change in entropy, is positive, a reaction will become more favorable. The larger is the value of delta S, the more favorable one reaction becomes. Number two, you learn about delta H, which is the change in entropy. So we know that all reactions with negative entropy values, they are exothermic and they are all favorable. So let's look at this example of a match. When you light up a match, the potential energy stored in the chemical bonds are now released. So it proceeds from a high entropy level or high heat energy stored in terms of chemical energy to a product with a lower entropy level. So the delta H is negative, it is exothermic. But ultimately, it is still about an increase in entropy. So if you look at this example, the chemicals and the wood molecules are bonded nicely together. But after the reaction, chemical bonds are broken, and you get the release of fume and heat, which is totally random and disordered. So therefore, as long as there is any free energy in the universe, something will happen. Work will be done to produce more entropy in the universe. So by combining all parameters together, it gives us an ultimate predictor of reaction favorability, which is Gibbs free energy, delta G. So delta G is the change in free energy. It is equal to delta H minus T times delta S, while H is enthalpy and S is entropy, while T is temperature measured in Kelvin. So whenever delta G is negative, that reaction is favorable, and when delta G is positive, that reaction is unfavorable. So looking at this information or this equation, it tells us why all exothermic reactions are favorable. That's because we know that the delta H for an exothermic reaction is negative. So something negative minus something, it will still give us a negative value. Therefore, they are favorable. And it also explains why some endothermic reactions are favorable as well. So provided that the change in entropy is big enough, something positive minus a bigger value will still give us a negative delta G. And therefore, some endothermic reaction can happen, provided that the change in entropy is positive, is big enough. Okay, again, as I mentioned, when the products are having a lower energy level than the reactants, the delta G is negative and that reaction is favorable. And when the products are having a higher energy level than the reactants, that delta G becomes positive and the reaction is unfavorable. So besides from telling us whether a reaction is favorable, the Gibbs free energy also tells us the maximum useful energy we can extract from a reaction. For example, the delta G of ATP hydrolysis is 32 kilojoule per mole under the standard condition. So we can never extract more than this value. Now, if you look at the cold pack again, although the dissolution of ammonium nitrate is an endothermic reaction because it has a very positive delta H, but because it produces a very large entropy delta S, so the overall delta G is still negative, which makes the reaction possible and favorable. And I also want to draw attention to T, which is temperature measured in Kelvin. What will happen when the temperature is higher? Yes, the delta G will become more negative. So this explains why reactions are more violent at high temperature because it has become more favorable. Okay, more examples of free energy. So showing here is the process of fermentation of glucose into ethanol, which happens when there is no oxygen. So judging from the value of the delta G, will you say this reaction is favorable? Yes, it is favorable. And is this an endothermic or exothermic reaction? It is exothermic as the delta H is negative. And it also has a positive delta S. Why is it so? Now you can see this from the reaction as the solid glucose molecules are now converted into liquid and gases, which are more disordered than the solid. So overall, this reaction is favorable because it has a negative delta G value. Okay, here is another example. I want you to predict whether this reaction is favorable. You will need your calculator. Okay, let's look at the answer. Here is the formula. Delta G is equal to delta H minus T delta S. So by plugging in all the values, you should be getting delta G equals to negative kilojoule per mole. So when the value of delta G is negative, it means this reaction is favorable. Just be careful with two things. Number one, with temperature, it is always measured in Kelvin, so you have to do this conversion. And number two, be careful with the plus and minus sign of the entropy, as you're going to get the answer wrong with a wrong sign. Okay, here is another example of free energy change. We know that an isolated protein is a long polypeptide chain, but once they come into contact with water molecules, they fold spontaneously into a 3D structure. So what is the driving force behind this reaction? Well, if you remember, we discussed this in lecture 18, by which protein folding is driven by hydrophobic interactions, so that we expose the hydrophilic groups on the surface to maximize hydrogen bond formation, because the more hydrogen bonds you get, the more stable is your protein structure. But actually, there is another explanation in terms of thermodynamics. So speaking in thermodynamics terms, entropy drives protein folding. But how? So showing here is a non-polar molecule. Can you find any water molecules forming out hydrogen bonds with the surface of this molecule? No, because this is non-polar. Instead, you will find water freezes around this molecule, forming up a highly ordered crystalline structure known as the clatrate shell. So when you have two non-polar molecules, you will get two clatrate shells. But because these molecules are non-polar, they can bind together by the hydrophobic interaction. So my question is, what changes the water molecules on the surface once you have this non-polar binding? Well, you'll get some of the water molecules displaced away from the shell. In other words, this process increases entropy, as the water molecules used to be static within the shell, but now they are free to flow around. Therefore, protein folding is mainly driven by entropy. As you can see from this diagram, by minimizing the clatrate shell, you get a very negative delta G. And therefore, this process of protein folding has become favorable and spontaneous. In the same manner, entropy also drives enzyme and substrate binding. So before binding, water molecules surround both of your substrate and enzymes, but upon binding, water molecules in the active site are expelled, and this increases the entropy within the system. So what is the importance of Gibbs free energy? Number one, it tells us whether a reaction will happen or not. Number two, it also tells us in which direction a reaction will proceed. So when delta G is negative, it means that reaction is favorable and it will proceed from the left hand side towards right hand side. On the other hand, when the delta G is positive, or when the reaction is unfavorable, it will simply occur from the right hand side towards the left hand side. And last but not least, it also tells us how much maximum useful energy we can extract from a reaction. Okay, here is another practice question. Please pause for a while to do your calculation. And the answer is B, negative 1209 kilojoule per mole. So if this reaction favorable, yes, because delta G is negative. But if you can see the delta S has a negative value, what does it mean? It means there is a decrease in disorder. Why is it so? Now if you look at the reactants, how many gaseous molecules do you have here? 1 plus 2.5, it gives you 3.5. While for the product molecules, you have 3 gaseous molecules. So as the reaction proceeds, it begins with 3.5 gaseous molecules and it ended up with 3 product molecules that are gaseous. So from disorderliness to less disorderliness, that explains why the delta S is negative. So I hope this makes sense to you. Now the key question to ask is, does life violate the second law of thermodynamics? Because from trillions of cells, they are free moving or they are isolated, we are organized into a single individual. So that process itself has a negative delta S. Well, the answer is life decreases its local entropy by increases the overall entropy of the universe. Look at what we have done with this Earth. We have produced so much pollution and global warming. So individually, we get a reduced entropy, yes, but globally, we increase the entropy. So think of a refrigerator. It cools down the interior by heating up its surrounding. Okay, now we have come to the final part of this lecture. We know that the ADP molecule is important in many reactions as it is the energy molecule. But the synthesis of ATP is unfavorable given that the delta G is positive. So how do we really synthesize ATP in our cells? Think about that. Well, the answer is the unfavorable ATP synthesis process is coupled to a favorable reaction that has a very negative delta G, such as the pumping of protons across the mitochondrial membrane. So you are going to learn this with me in biochemistry, so I'm not going to elaborate further. Okay, we have come to the end of this session, and I hope by now you should know what are the three important parameters that will decide whether a reaction will happen or not, which are delta H, delta S, and temperature. And by combining these parameters, we have the ultimate predictor of reaction favorability, which is delta G. When delta G is negative, that reaction is favorable.